There's a carousel on Washington Avenue in Johnson City, New York, that has been spinning since 1920. It costs nothing to ride. It has always cost nothing to ride. On summer afternoons, children who have no idea who paid for it or why climb on and hold the painted poles and go around and around in the particular suspended joy of carnival motion, entirely unaware that they are sitting inside an argument about what capitalism could have been. The man who installed this carousel also installed 3 others across the same cluster of small cities in the southern tier of New York State. He built for hospitals, operated 12 tanneries, ran his own farm to supply his own leather, constructed 62 factories, laid private railroad spurs to move materials between them, and at the height of his operation employed 1 out of every 5 working adults in Broome County. His company produced 52 million pairs of shoes in a single year, and at its peak held more than half of the American work shoe market, a dominance so complete that miners in Appalachia, longshoremen in Baltimore, and steel workers in Pittsburgh were, without knowing it, wearing the product of one man's obsession with doing things properly. Then the factories went quiet, not quickly, not from a single catastrophic error, over roughly 25 years, with agonizing deliberateness. One of the most dominant industrial operations in American history contracted into irrelevance, while its own leadership watched and found itself unable, for reasons that were entirely coherent, to stop it. The carousel still turns. The factories mostly stand empty, and the distance between those 2 facts contains one of the most instructive and genuinely tragic stories in the history of American manufacturing. The education of a factory floor. George Francis Johnson was born in 1857 in Milford, Massachusetts, into a family whose relationship to the shoe industry was intimate and subordinate. His father was a shoe worker, not an owner, not a foreman, not a clerk, a man who performed specific operations on specific components of specific shoes, day after day, for wages that covered necessities and left nothing for contingency. This origin is not biographical background. It is the entire explanation for everything that followed. The industrial titans of the Gilded Age were, almost without exception, men whose genius expressed itself from a distance. Andrew Carnegie understood steel as a system of capital flows and technological trajectories. John D. Rockefeller never operated a refinery. Henry Ford's transformative insight was organizational, not manual. The separation between these men and the physical act of production gave them a kind of strategic altitude, the ability to see industries as structures rather than as daily realities. That was genuinely valuable and genuinely limited in specific ways. Johnson had no such distance. He grew up inside the production reality. He understood from childhood what the extractive model of industrial capitalism felt like, from the position of the person being extracted from, the vulnerability, the expendability, the way a worker's entire economic existence could be disrupted by decisions made by men who would never meet him, never walk the floor he worked, never understand that the quality of what he produced was inseparable from the quality of the conditions under which he produced it. He left school at 14, economic necessity, not indifference, and spent the next several years in Massachusetts shoe shops, absorbing the logic of an industry with an attention that went far beyond what his immediate tasks required. He watched where value was created in the manufacturing process and where it was captured. He developed, at an age when most boys were thinking about other things entirely, unusually precise opinions about the relationship between workforce treatment and product quality. In 1881, at 24, he arrived in Binghamton, New York, hired as a general worker at the Luster Brothers Shoe Factory. The southern tier of New York was not yet a manufacturing center of any significance, but Johnson recognized within weeks something that the region's current operators had not noticed: an unusual convergence of underutilized advantages. Hemlock forests in the surrounding hills provided abundant tanbark for leather processing. The Susquehanna River offered water access and transportation links. Land prices were low, and the streams of Central European immigration that had been depositing Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and Italian families throughout the region during the previous decade had created a labor pool that was large, willing, and, critically, trainable. His rise within the Lester brothers' operation was rapid in the specific way that genuine operational competence tends to be rapid when it encounters an environment that has been managed at a level beneath its actual capability. Within 3 years he held the superintendent's position. Within 7 he had become a partner. He got there not through financial maneuvering or social connection, but by being demonstrably better at every aspect of shoe manufacturing than anyone around him, better at reading a production line, better at sequencing operations, better at restructuring incentives, and most distinctively, better at reading people. This last capacity was not sentimental. Johnson possessed a quality that was analytical rather than empathetic in the conventional sense, the ability to understand workers as variables in a production system with a precision that his contemporaries entirely lacked. He could walk a factory floor after implementing a change and know from the pace at which men moved between stations, from the angle of shoulders, from the particular quality of ambient noise, whether the optimization had cost something in morale that would eventually express itself as cost and quality. He was measuring things that nobody had designed instruments to measure, and he was doing it accurately. The key insight, the one that would eventually make Endicott Johnson the largest shoe manufacturer in the world, was that the cost of treating workers badly was not zero. It appeared on no standard ledger in any immediately legible form, but it was real, compounding, and systematically underestimated by every competitor in the industry. Turnover cost money to replace accumulated knowledge. Resentment degraded the precision that quality work required. Exhaustion introduced variability that inspection couldn't reliably catch. The extractive model that presented itself as efficiency was actually expensive in ways that conventional accounting couldn't capture because conventional accounting hadn't been designed to look for those costs. Johnson designed his accounting around them. The formal founding of Endicott Johnson Corporation traces to 1890, when Johnson and his financial partner Henry B. Endicott reorganized the Lester brothers' operation with new capital and a new purpose. The initial capitalization was modest, roughly $200,000, but the ambition it funded was not financial in the conventional sense. Johnson was not trying to build a financial structure. He was trying to build a system. The partnership worked because the two men's capabilities were genuinely complementary, without overlapping. Endicott brought capital, Eastern banking relationships, and fluency in the language of business finance that Johnson had never cultivated. Johnson brought everything related to actually making shoes: production mastery, workforce relationships, operational vision, and the developing philosophy of labor relations that he called the square deal, borrowing Theodore Roosevelt's language while giving it substance that Roosevelt's political rhetoric never quite achieved. The square deal rested on a premise that was, in the context of 1890s American manufacturing, genuinely radical. The premise was not moral, or not primarily moral. It was economic. A stable, skilled, motivated workforce would produce better shoes at lower per-unit cost than a constantly churned pool of desperate replaceable hands, and the savings generated by stability would more than offset the higher wages and benefits that maintaining stability required. This distinction matters. Positions held on moral grounds are vulnerable to economic pressure when margins compress. Charity gets scrutinized. Positions held on economic grounds can be maintained even when times are difficult, because they continue to generate the returns that justify them. Johnson's square deal was structured as a strategy that happened to align with his personal values, which proved to be a far more durable combination than either pure ethics or pure calculation would have been separately. The first serious test came in 1892, when labor conflicts shut down several large New England shoe manufacturers. E.J., already developing a regional reputation for fair wages and humane conditions, attracted experienced workers walking off those floors, men carrying years of accumulated skill and technical knowledge that couldn't be rapidly replicated in workers drawn from the general labor pool. The quality advantage this created was measurable in market response within 18 months. E.J. shoes, already competitive, became demonstrably superior to the output of factories that had broken their workforces. and attempted to rebuild them with replacements. Johnson did not experience this as ideological vindication. He experienced it as a data point. He proceeded empirically, doing more of what worked, adjusting what didn't. Watching results with the same methodical attention, he brought to production process optimization. By 1900, EJ was producing approaching 6 million pairs of shoes annually, employing roughly 4,000 workers, and beginning to attract the kind of industry attention that signals a company becoming something more than regional. The foundations had been laid for something that had no real precedent in American manufacturing, a parallel society between 1900 and 1920. Endicott Johnson Corporation constructed something that defied straightforward categorization, simultaneously a business strategy, a social experiment, and an expression in brick and steel, and medical equipment and carousel horses of one man's convictions about what industrial capitalism could actually look like if the people running it chose to take it seriously. The wage premium came first and remained constant, 15 to 20% above industry average throughout the period, sustained at a level that made EJ employment genuinely desirable in competitive labor markets, without tipping into financial non-viability. Johnson tracked the productivity return on this premium with a precision that would have surprised anyone who assumed his generosity was organized altruism. It wasn't. It was investment with measured returns, and the returns justified the investment. Year after year, free medical care evolved from a company-funded clinic in the early years of the century into a full hospital, eventually for hospitals across the Triple Cities, staffed by physicians employed by EJ, providing treatment at no cost to workers and their immediate families. Johnson's reasoning was characteristically analytical. A serious illness, left untreated because of cost, could destroy a family's economic stability in ways that took years to repair, creating debt burdens and chronic anxiety that degraded both the quality of working life and, by direct extension, the quality of work. Free medicine wasn't charity. It was the removal of a specific, measurable source of performance-degrading stress. The parks followed from a similar logic, scaled to a different dimension of human need. Johnson funded the construction of several parks across the Triple Cities, ball fields, picnic grounds, landscaped spaces maintained at company expense and open without charge or condition. To all employees and their families, the Country Club, an institution exclusively associated with wealth in early 20th century America, was built on a democratic model, membership free to EJ workers, facilities genuinely comparable in quality to private clubs serving wealthy members elsewhere. And then there were the carousels Johnson installed for full-size carousels at four different points across the community, operated them free of charge, and maintained them as a permanent feature of community life. The gesture was theatrical, but theater in this context was not frivolity. It was communication, a visible, daily, physically present statement that the company that employed this community's adults considered its children's happiness a legitimate corporate concern. Every child who climbed onto a carousel horse in Johnson City or Endicott or Binghamton on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon was receiving a message about what this place valued, even if no child would have articulated it that way. By 1910, the workforce had grown to 12,000 people across 31 factories, with annual production approaching 25 million pairs. EJ controlled approximately 35% of the American workshoe market, a concentration already remarkable and still growing. The regional impact was total in a way that defied casual summary. EJ was not the largest employer in the Triple Cities. It was the economic atmosphere that every other economic activity breathed. George Johnson understood what this meant, and he embraced the full weight of it. The company and the community in his framework were not separate entities, with occasionally conflicting interests. They were the same entity viewed from different angles. A company that exploited its community was a company that was systematically destroying its own operational foundations. A company that invested in its community was a company investing in its own long-term productivity and stability. The theory was coherent. The practice was, for several decades, genuinely remarkable. And embedded within both was a set of assumptions about the permanence of leather, about the indefinite relevance of skilled hand labor, about the continued dominance of Northeastern manufacturing that would prove in time to be the framework's fatal architecture. The 1920s represent Endicott Johnson at its absolute maximum, a period of production, employment, and market dominance without parallel in the subsequent history of the American shoe industry. Annual production peaked at 52 million pairs in 1927. Consider what that number actually represents. 52 million pairs of shoes produced in a single year by a single company. Operating within a 30-mile radius of Binghamton, New York, the factories ran multiple shifts. 12 tanneries processed more leather than any comparable operation in North America. The workforce had reached 22,000 employees in a region with a total population of approximately 100,000, meaning that nearly every household in the Triple Cities had a direct connection to EJ payroll. At 52% of the American work shoe segment, EJ was not merely the dominant producer. It was, functionally, the category itself. Every other manufacturer competed in the margins of a market that Endicott Johnson defined. The miners of West Virginia, the dock workers of Philadelphia, the construction crews of Chicago, when they laced their boots in the morning, the majority of them were wearing shoes cut, stitched, lasted, and finished somewhere in upstate New York. The physical infrastructure required to sustain this scale was extraordinary by any measure. The largest tannery covered several acres of floor space. EJ operated its own farm to supply hides, supplemented by purchased stock from across the country and from South America. A private railroad spur moved raw materials in and finished goods out with logistics efficiency that compared favorably to anything operating in American industry at the time. A wire factory produced the eyelets and hardware that went into millions of pairs annually. The vertical integration was not primarily a cost strategy. It was a quality strategy. By owning every production stage from rawhide to finished shoe, EJ could enforce standards at each step that external procurement could never guarantee. The leather in an EJ work boot had been processed to EJ specifications by EJ workers in EJ tanneries. The stitching had been performed by workers whose skill levels EJ had developed and maintained over years of continuous employment. Quality wasn't achieved through final inspection. It was built into the production structure itself. George Johnson, now in his 60s, remained an active presence on factory floors throughout the decade, walking lines, asking questions about specific operations, listening to answers with the full attention of a man who understood that information flowing upward from production reality was the most valuable intelligence a manufacturing operation could possess. Workers who remembered him from this period described someone who was both physically commanding and genuinely curious, who recalled individual names across facilities with a recall that seemed impossible at the scale EJ had achieved, who communicated by his presence alone a message that no employee handbook could carry, that the work being done on these floors mattered, and that he knew it and had not forgotten it. In 1919, EJ introduced profit sharing, a program distributing a percentage of annual earnings directly to workers based on tenure and position. The timing was deliberate. The post-World War I period was generating significant labor unrest across American industry. As workers sought to capture a share of wartime prosperity they felt had been built on their labor, Johnson's response was characteristically preemptive. He institutionalized the sharing before it was demanded, framing it not as a concession, but as a recognition of what workers had always been owed. In September 1920, he gathered his workforce in staggered assemblies across multiple facilities. No single space was large enough to hold everyone, and made a commitment that would define the company's strategic options for the next 4 decades. He would not move the factories south. He would not chase cheaper labor. This company had been built here by these people, and it would remain here. The workers who heard it believed him. They had 40 years of evidence that when this man made a commitment, he kept it. The hospital was real. The carousels were real. The wages had always been real. What none of them could see, what Johnson himself, at 63, perhaps could not fully see, was that the world in which this commitment made complete strategic sense was already, quietly, beginning to dissolve. The structural pressures that would eventually dismantle Endicott Johnson were not sudden. They accumulated over roughly 30 years through 3 simultaneous transformations of the competitive landscape, each visible in advance, each discussed in trade publications, each representing a trajectory that pointed toward a fundamentally different industry, and each one navigated by EJ management with a combination of intelligence, care, and ultimately inadequate response. The first was the Southern Shift, which had been a distant pressure since the early 1920s and became a dominant structural reality. In the decade after World War II, manufacturers in Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas had spent 2 decades building capacity and developing workforce capability. They emerged from the war with modern facilities, increasingly skilled labor, and cost structures running 40 to 50% below Northeastern levels. The quality gap that had long protected EJ's premium positioning had largely closed. The price gap had not died by 1952. Southern producers held approximately 28% of the work shoe market. By 1958, they were approaching 40%. The share was coming almost entirely from Northeastern manufacturers, and EJ, as the largest Northeastern producer by a wide margin, was providing the largest portion of it. The company's response was to compete on quality and established relationships, maintaining price points above Southern producers while investing in product consistency and retail partnerships. The logic was coherent. The execution was strong. The strategy was insufficient because the buyers making bulk purchasing decisions for mining companies, construction firms, and industrial employers were not primarily influenced by brand loyalty. They were influenced by cost per acceptable pair. As Southern quality crossed the acceptability threshold, price became the primary variable, and EJ had not been designed to win on price. The second transformation was materials. The development of durable synthetic compounds suitable for shoe construction, beginning with improved rubber for soles and progressing through the 1950s toward polymers, capable of substituting for leather in uppers, represented a direct challenge to a company whose entire production system was organized around natural leather processing. This is where EJ's vertical integration created a structural trap that deserves careful examination because it operates at a level of subtlety that makes it easy to miss. The tanneries were not inefficiencies or legacy accidents. They were genuine competitive assets, capable of processing leather to precise quality specifications at scale, with consistency that external procurement couldn't reliably match. But they were assets whose value was entirely conditional on leather remaining the primary material. For the type of shoes EJ produced, every percentage point that synthetics captured in the work shoe market was a percentage point that undermined the economic justification for 12 tanneries and everything operationally organized around them. Management faced a choice with no clean solution: embrace synthetics aggressively and write off decades of tannery investment while conceding the quality differentiation that justified premium pricing, or resist synthetics and cede market share to producers not carrying EJ's legacy cost structure. EJ chose the middle path: cautious adoption, selective product lines, continued emphasis on leather quality as a marketing position. The choice was defensible year by year, compounded across the full arc of the transformation. It produced a strategic lag that became increasingly expensive. The third transformation was automation. New machinery developed primarily in Ohio and Massachusetts could perform the stitching, lasting, and finishing operations that had historically required skilled hand labor, performing them with greater consistency and at substantially higher throughput. The capital investment required to retool an EJ facility for modern automated production was significant but not prohibitive for a company of EJ's resources. The human cost was a different matter entirely. Automation at Endicott Johnson was not a technology adoption question. It was a question about the meaning of the company. The square deal had been constructed on the premise that skilled, experienced human labor was EJ's core competitive asset, the source of the quality differential that justified premium pricing and the workforce stability that made the community investment self-financing. Automation challenged that premise directly. More immediately, automation meant fewer workers, And fewer workers meant dismantling, incrementally but inevitably, the entire community infrastructure that had been built on the assumption of large-scale permanent employment. The hospital served workers, the parks served workers and their families, the profit-sharing served workers. Remove the workers and you remove the operational rationale for everything. George Johnson had spent 60 years constructing. EJ automated later, more slowly and less completely than competitors who were not carrying the same obligations. The productivity gap this created was real and compounding. Each year of delayed automation was another year in which competitors improved their per-pair production costs while EJ's remained anchored to labor-intensive processes that had been optimal in 1935, but were increasingly non-competitive in 1958. The mathematics of decline between 1950 and 1968. Endicott Johnson's position in American shoe manufacturing deteriorated in ways that raw output numbers partially obscured, but that market share figures made impossible to deny. Annual production, which had peaked at 52 million pairs in 1927 and recovered to approximately 45 million through the post-war expansion, began declining in the mid-1950s. Slowly at first, the kind of decline that looks like a rough patch rather than a structural shift, then with a momentum that reflected something irreversible. By 1960, production had fallen into the low 30s of millions. By 1965, below 25 million. By 1968, below 15 million. Market share figures were starker still. From 52% at peak, EJ's share of the work shoe segment had declined to approximately 31% by 1958. Still the market leader, still the largest single producer, but moving in a direction that compounded relentlessly. By 1963, the share was below 20%. By 1967, it was estimated at less than 12%. The workforce tracked production downward with a lag produced by the company's continued commitment to absorbing contraction through attrition rather than layoffs wherever possible. In 1950, approximately 18,000 workers. By 1960, 14,000. By 1965, under 10,000. By 1968, below 6,000. Each of these numbers was a family in the triple cities whose economic situation had changed, or was in the process of changing. Each represented a household built around the expectation of EJ employment, a mortgage, a car payment, children in school. Now, confronting a kind of uncertainty that 3 generations of EJ stability had made almost literally unthinkable, the management response throughout this period was consistently operational rather than strategic. Cost reduction programs, product line rationalization, consolidation of manufacturing into the most efficient remaining facilities, closures handled with as much care for individual circumstances as the finances permitted, generous severance where possible, priority placement in remaining EJ operations, collaboration with union leadership to minimize disruption, for all its genuine care. It was a managed dismantling. The financial trajectory made the end increasingly legible. EJ had generated strong margins through most of the 1940s, margins that funded the community infrastructure, the profit sharing, and the financial reserves that management treated as a buffer for difficult periods ahead. By the late 1950s, those margins had compressed dramatically under simultaneous pressure from market share loss, structural cost disadvantage, and the fixed costs of maintaining a benefit infrastructure built for 20,000 workers, while actually employing half that number. By the mid-1960s, core manufacturing operations were running near break-even. By 1967, several major facilities were losing money outright. The board voted in 1969 to restructure manufacturing operations. The language was careful and euphemistic, as such language tends to be. The reality was that the manufacturing infrastructure of Endicott Johnson, built over 80 years to produce 52 million pairs of shoes annually, was being wound down. The direction and destination were no longer uncertain. In most histories of industrial collapse, the community appears late in the epilogue, in photographs of empty streets and population statistics, as the human backdrop to an economic narrative that has already concluded. The Endicott-Johnson story doesn't permit this structure, because the community and the company were so thoroughly the same entity that the community's distress began while the company was still nominally operating. And that distress, in turn, shaped the company's final years in ways that closed off options and accelerated the outcome. The first visible contractions of EJ's community commitments appeared in the late 1950s. The free hospital began offering reduced services, then began charging modest fees, then was eventually transferred out of company ownership entirely. The parks handed over to municipal authority were maintained at declining standards because the municipalities lacked the resources of a profitable industrial company. 3 of the 4 carousels transferred to city management fell into visible disrepair, and visible disrepair of a carousel in a community that had understood for decades that the carousel's existence was a statement about what the company valued, communicated something that could not be softened with press releases. These were individually modest reductions. Collectively, they were a message that residents could read without access to any financial statements. The system that had sustained this community for 6 decades was withdrawing. The permanence that George Johnson had promised and delivered for 40 years was not, it turned out, permanent. The political response was pressure for stasis. Local officials urging EJ to maintain commitments, to keep facilities open, to protect employment. The union pushed for wage increases and benefit protections, even as the financial situation deteriorated, on the logic that if closures were coming regardless, workers needed to extract maximum compensation from remaining work. Each response was individually rational. The collective result was to increase costs, reduce flexibility, and make adaptation more difficult at exactly the moment when adaptation was most urgently required. No individual actor in this dynamic was behaving unreasonably. Management was trying to honor commitments while managing structural deterioration. Workers were trying to protect themselves using the tools available to them. Politicians were trying to preserve the community their constituents depended on. The result was a collective action problem, in which everyone's rational individual response made the overall outcome worse, a structure that the company's own history had created by making the community so thoroughly dependent on a single economic foundation. The last EJ factory complexes ran reduced shifts into the early 1970s. Workers who had been hired by supervisors who had been hired by men who had known George Johnson personally reported to facilities that were quieter every month, doing work that was a remnant of what the work had been. By 1974, manufacturing employment was below 2,000. By 1980, it was effectively zero. The brand name survived the manufacturing operation by decades, transferred through acquisitions to companies with no connection to upstate New York. EJ work boots are manufactured and sold today by companies operating in the Southeast and through overseas sourcing. They are competent boots. They carry a name that means nothing to the people who make them, and something deeply specific to people whose grandparents made shoes in Binghamton. The temptation when confronting the Endicott-Johnson story is to search for the decision, the single strategic error from which all subsequent deterioration derived, the fork in the road where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. This search should be abandoned because it systematically misrepresents what actually happened. The collapse of Endicott-Johnson was not the result of a mistake. It was the result of an excellent model encountering conditions for which it had not been designed and that it could not adapt to without ceasing to be itself. The first lesson is about vertical integration and the assumptions it encodes. EJ's tanneries, its farm, its wire factory, its complete internal supply chain. These were not legacies of managerial inertia. They were deliberate strategic choices that had produced real competitive advantages across multiple decades. The logic was sound: control every production stage, enforce quality standards at every step, capture value that would otherwise accrue to external suppliers. But vertical integration is a bet on specific inputs remaining valuable. Every dollar EJ invested in leather processing infrastructure was a dollar whose value was contingent on leather remaining the primary material. For work shoe production, the tanneries were not assets with independent value. They were conditional assets, enormously valuable under specific conditions, genuinely burdensome when those conditions shifted. The failure was not building the tanneries. The failure was not building into the company's planning framework an explicit mechanism for periodically interrogating the assumptions the tanneries encoded. E.J. needed, from perhaps the mid-1940s onward, a standing discipline of asking, if we were designing this production system today, with what we know about where materials technology is heading, would we make these same choices? What would it cost to transition? What are the early signals we should be watching? Established facts are the hardest things to question, precisely because so much has been organized around them. The second lesson concerns the difference between a strategy and an identity. The square deal was, at its origin, a strategy, a specific approach to workforce management that generated measurable competitive advantages through retention, productivity, and quality. It worked because it was suited to its competitive environment, a market where quality differentiation commanded premium pricing, where skilled human labor was a genuine production advantage, and where E.J.'s compensation represented a meaningful premium over available alternatives. All three of those conditions degraded simultaneously between 1950 and 1965. The quality differential eroded as Southern producers matured. The premium on skilled hand labor declined as automation reduced its relative importance. The compensation advantage compressed. As Southern labor markets developed, the square deal as a strategy required periodic recalibration, a willingness to ask what the current version of the commitment should look like under current conditions. But the square deal had been transformed over 60 years from a strategy into an identity. You cannot recalibrate an identity without ceasing to be the thing the identity describes. This is the deepest trap in the Endicott-Johnson story, and it has no clean solution. The very success of the approach had made the approach unavailable for revision. The third lesson is about the double-edged nature of community investment. George Johnson's investment in the Triple Cities was not a corporate social responsibility program in any modern sense, not a reputational gesture calculated to generate goodwill. It was a fundamental component of the competitive model, producing real returns through workforce retention, labor market positioning, and the social stability that deep community roots provided. But it also created, over decades, a set of obligations and expectations that constrained E.J.'s strategic options. As the competitive environment deteriorated, the 1920 pledge was the most visible constraint, but the entire fabric of the relationship, the hospitals, the parks, the carousels, the generations of families who had organized their economic lives around E.J. employment, created moral obligations that were genuine and weighty, and that made certain strategically available responses effectively unavailable. A company with no community attachments, facing identical competitive pressures in the 1950s, would have had options that were painful but survivable: Southern expansion, overseas sourcing, workforce reduction, asset monetization, merger with a better capitalized operator. E.J. considered all of these options and found each of them, for reasons that were entirely coherent, impossible to implement without destroying something essential about what the company was, the community investment that had been a competitive strength in the growth years became a strategic constraint in the contraction years, not because the investment had been wrong, but because the conditions that had made it sustainable had changed in ways its architects had not anticipated. The fourth and most uncomfortable lesson is this: a company can be too excellent at one specific thing. E.J. was extraordinarily good at making leather work shoes using skilled human labor, organized around a specific set of values and relationships, developed over 8 decades. The excellence was entirely real: the quality, the workforce culture, the operational systems, the community integration. None of it was performance. But excellence in a specific domain is always conditional on that domain's continued relevance. When the domain, leather work shoes, northeastern manufacturing, the premium on skilled hand labor, became less central to the competitive landscape, E.J.'s excellence became a form of organizational specificity that limited its capacity to become excellent at anything else. The capabilities, the culture, the institutional knowledge, the physical infrastructure, All of it had been optimized for one thing. The companies that survived the transformation of American shoe manufacturing were not the best practitioners of the old model. They were the ones that had maintained enough organizational flexibility, enough separation between their capabilities and their identity to recognize the new model and move toward it. Competence with adaptability outlasted excellence without it. The restoration of the Washington Avenue carousel took place in 2008 through a non-profit effort funded partly by former EJ employees and their descendants, people who understood in a way that resists easy articulation that the carousel was not merely a historical artifact but a living statement about what had once been possible in this specific place, and about the refusal to let that possibility be entirely forgotten. Drive through Endicott on an autumn afternoon and you will see the factories block after block of brick industrial architecture, built for a scale of ambition and production that has no contemporary equivalent in the region. Some buildings have been converted. A former factory housing a business incubator employs perhaps 300 people in a space that once employed 3,000. Others have become apartments or storage or nothing in particular. Most stand intact, their proportions communicating something about the seriousness with which they were built, about the expectation of permanence that went into their construction. The windows that remain unbroken reflect the sky. The loading docks that once processed millions of pairs of shoes are silent. The triple cities, Binghamton, Endicott, Johnson City, have not recovered from EJ's departure in any sense that the word recovery usually implies. Population has declined from post-war peaks. The economic foundation that 60 years of EJ employment provided has not been replaced by any single successor. The region has developed a partial economic life organized around healthcare, education, government services, and the remnants of diversified manufacturing, a life that is real and in many respects resilient, but that operates at a smaller scale and with less certainty than the world EJ created. What EJ built was specific to its moment, specific to a convergence of conditions, material and economic and social and geographic, that obtained for a particular window of time in a particular corner of American history. George Johnson's achievement was seeing within those conditions what was possible, and building it with an intensity and a consistency that, over 6 decades, changed what was normal for the people who lived inside it. The wages were higher, the medical care was real and free, the parks were well maintained, the country club was open to everyone, and the carousels turned every afternoon, for every child, at no charge, because a man who had grown up in a factory town believed that pleasure was not a luxury that only wealthy people deserved. What couldn't ultimately be preserved was not the commitment but the conditions under which the commitment was financially sustainable. The leather gave way to synthetics. The skilled hand gave way to automated machinery. The northeastern cost structure gave way to the southern wage differential. These were not failures of character or failures of vision. They were the ordinary metabolism of industrial change, moving at a pace that even a company as sophisticated and as committed as Endicott Johnson could not outrun indefinitely. The deepest truth may be the simplest one. Some achievements cannot be repeated, not because the people who created them were uniquely brilliant, though Johnson was, but because they were uniquely suited to a specific convergence of circumstances that passes once and does not return. You cannot build another Endicott Johnson because you cannot reassemble the conditions that made it possible. The window opened. A man walked through it and built something extraordinary. The window closed behind him. What remains is the carousel turning on Washington Avenue, and the factories patient in the autumn light, and the memory carried in families across generations, specific and stubborn and not quite ready to be called history, of a time when a shoe company in upstate New York proved, for several extraordinary decades, that it was possible to build something large and profitable and genuinely good, and that the world was not obligated to make room for it forever.